The year was 1826, and the edge of America was still wild and unknown. Forests stretched for miles. The Rocky Mountains were only whispers on a map. And somewhere in a small Missouri town, a teenage boy named Christopher Houston Carson, people called him Kit, was getting ready to disappear. He wasn't rich. He wasn't famous. He was just 16. But deep inside there was something restless. A voice calling him west. A voice that would change not only his life, but the story of America itself. Kit was born on Christmas Eve, 1809, in a log cabin in Kentucky. His family was poor but tough. His father was a farmer who believed that hard work made a man honest. When Kit was just a small boy, the family packed everything they owned and moved west to Missouri, chasing the promise of new land. Frontier life was cruel. There were no schools, no doctors, and no time for childhood. By the age of 9, Kit had learned to plow, hunt, and fight to survive. Then, tragedy struck. The father he admired was killed by a falling tree while clearing land. From that day, the boy's world changed forever. His mother tried to keep the family together, but there were too many mouths to feed. So, when Kit turned 13, she sent him to work as an apprentice to a saddle maker in the nearby town of Franklin. For 2 long years, Kit bent leather, polished buckles, and dreamed of something more. Each day, travelers came into the shop, fur trappers, explorers, soldiers. They told stories about the faraway mountains and the shining rivers of the West. Their tales filled Kit's imagination like sparks in dry grass. One summer evening, when the air was thick and still, Kit made his choice. He looked at his rough hands, the saddle tools hanging on the wall, and the empty street outside. Then he whispered to himself, "I'm not meant for this." Before dawn, he packed a small bundle, some bread, a knife, and a blanket. Without saying goodbye, he walked away from town. The boy who left that morning wasn't just running away from work. He was running toward a destiny no one could have imagined. The trail he followed was known as the Santa Fe Trail, a dangerous path stretching hundreds of miles across the plains. It was the lifeline between Missouri and the Spanish lands of the Southwest. Caravans of traders carried goods, cloth, guns, and dreams. Many never made it back. Bandits, wild animals, and storms swallowed travelers whole. Kit joined a wagon train as a helper. He earned no pay, only food and the promise of adventure. Days turned into weeks as the wagons rolled across endless grasslands. At night, Kit slept beneath the stars and listened to the howling wind. He learned how to cook over an open fire, fix broken wheels, and read the sky for weather. Somewhere along that dusty road, the scared boy from Missouri began to fade away. In his place grew a young man who could face hunger, thirst, and fear, and keep going. When the caravan finally reached Santa Fe, Kit felt like he had stepped into another universe. The air smelled of smoke and spice. Spanish, English, and native voices mixed in the market. He saw people dressed in bright colors, horses with silver saddles, and traders counting coins. He didn't understand everything, but he understood one thing clearly. He belonged here. In Santa Fe, Kit took odd jobs, working for traders and learning Spanish. He spent nights around campfires, listening to stories of faraway rivers and snow-capped peaks. He met trappers who spoke of a secret life in the mountains, living free, following the rivers, hunting beaver for their precious pelts. To Kit, they were heroes, men who needed no map, no master, no permission. That was the life he wanted. A few months later, Kit joined a group of fur trappers heading north into the Rockies. It was the most dangerous job a young man could take. But Kit didn't hesitate. Through icy rivers and endless forests, he proved himself brave and clever. He could track an animal by broken twigs, sense weather before clouds appeared, and ride through blizzards with nothing but a coat and courage. The older trappers began to notice him. They said, "That boy Carson? He's got the mountain in his blood." Years later, the name Kit Carson would echo across America. People would write songs and stories about the boy who ran away and found the edge of the world. But in those early days, Kit wasn't thinking about fame. He was thinking about survival. Every sunrise was a victory. Every night by the fire was a blessing. He wasn't a hero yet. He was just a young man learning what it meant to live free. No one in Missouri ever saw him return. No one could imagine that the runaway saddlemaker's boy would one day stand beside generals, map the West, and shape the destiny of a nation. But that's where this story truly begins. Because before Kit Carson became a legend, he was just a boy with nothing but a dream, a knife, and the endless horizon in front of him. The morning sun rose over the high plains as Kit Carson rode alongside a group of mountain men. His clothes were worn, his boots covered in dust, and his hands rough from work, but his eyes were bright. He was only in his early 20s, yet the hard land had already shaped him into something older than his years. Every mile taught him new lessons. The wilderness was his teacher, and survival was his only test. Life among the trappers was harsh. They woke before dawn, packed their mules, and rode into wild country in search of rivers rich with beaver. Every day was filled with danger, from grizzlies, freezing storms, or hostile raids. Many men who set out on those journeys never came back. But Kit had something rare. He was quiet, careful, and alert. He listened more than he spoke. The others began to notice that wherever Carson went, things seemed to go right. His instincts were sharp and his courage steady. At night, when the campfire burned low, Kit listened to the older men tell stories of near-death escapes and battles with tribes. They drank whiskey and laughed loudly, but Kit stayed calm, his mind soaking in every word. He was learning how to read the wild, how to follow animal tracks, how to smell snow in the air, how to build shelter from nothing. The mountains were no longer a mystery to him. They were home. As seasons passed, Kit traveled through lands that most Americans had never seen. He crossed frozen passes, deep forests, and deserts that seemed endless. He traded with native tribes, learned their ways, and picked up their languages. He spoke Spanish fluently, too, a skill that made him valuable wherever he went. People began to trust him, traders, soldiers, and even the tribes themselves. But the wilderness demanded a price. Winters were brutal. Food was scarce. Many trappers died from cold or hunger. Kit had seen friends freeze to death beside him. Once, when supplies ran out, he ate roots and boiled strips of leather just to stay alive. Still, he refused to turn back. Something inside him kept pushing forward. A quiet belief that this wild life had a purpose, even if he couldn't yet see it. In the years that followed, Kit became known among the mountain men as one of the best guides in the West. His name carried weight from the Rockies to New Mexico. When men got lost, they said, "Find Kit Carson, he'll bring you home." He wasn't loud or proud, but he had the kind of respect that only comes from action. He saved lives, led lost travelers out of snowstorms, and fought off wild animals without panic. One cold winter, while trapping along the Gila River, Kit faced one of his most dangerous moments. His small party was surrounded by a group of Apaches. The men were outnumbered and low on ammunition. Kit knew that if they fought, none would live. Instead of firing, he stepped forward slowly, his rifle lowered, and began to speak in their tongue. He offered them food, tobacco, and peace. The Apache leader stared at him in silence. Then, with a nod, he accepted. The trappers were spared. That day, Kit proved that courage wasn't just about shooting fast, it was about understanding people. Years later, stories of Kit's bravery began to spread. Traders carried his name across the frontier. Soldiers spoke of a young trapper who could guide through any wilderness, no matter how harsh. But Kit himself never bragged. When someone called him a hero, he'd smile slightly and say, "Just doing my part." To him, heroism meant survival, not fame. He spent a few peaceful years working with trading companies, moving goods between forts and settlements. He made friends with many tribes and earned their respect through fairness and honesty. He married a Native American woman, and for a while, he found happiness in the simple rhythm of frontier life. But the mountains never let go of him for long. Every few months he felt the pull of the open trail, the endless sky, the sound of rushing rivers, the thrill of discovery. He was made for that life, even if it meant loneliness. By the early 1840s, Kit Carson was already becoming a legend among men who lived on the edge of civilization. Still, he lived modestly, never thinking of himself as famous. But fate was about to change everything. One evening, while traveling through St. Louis, he met a tall, determined man named John C. Frémont, a young Army officer planning to lead an expedition to map the uncharted lands of the American West. Frémont needed a guide, someone who knew the mountains, who could lead men through unknown danger. Every trader and trapper he asked gave him the same name: "Find Kit Carson." When Frémont finally met him, he was surprised. Kit was small, quiet, and calm, with a soft voice that carried authority without effort. He didn't look like the fierce frontiersman of legend. But when he spoke, his words were clear and confident. Frémont knew instantly that he had found the right man. That meeting marked the beginning of one of the greatest partnerships in the history of the American frontier. For Kit Carson, it was the start of a new chapter, one that would carry him far beyond the silent rivers and lonely trails he knew so well. The mountains had made him strong. The wilderness had taught him wisdom. Now history was calling his name. He would soon ride into a world of fame, war, and legend. But at that moment, he was still the same quiet man who once walked away from a saddle shop with nothing but courage and a dream. And as the sun sank behind the horizon, Kit looked out at the vast, open land stretching before him. He didn't know it yet, but the road ahead would make him a symbol of the American West, both its glory and its tragedy. His story was only beginning. The year was 1842. The West was still a mystery, a land of danger and dreams that stretched beyond the edge of every map. For most people, those blank spaces meant fear. But for Kit Carson, they meant freedom. He had already spent years living among mountains, rivers, and deserts, guiding traders and trappers through lands where few dared to travel. He spoke Spanish and several native languages. He knew which plants healed wounds, which clouds meant rain, and which winds whispered of storms. But he had never imagined that one day his name would be tied to one of the most famous expeditions in American history. That day came when Kit met Captain John Charles Frémont. Frémont was a young, ambitious U.S. Army officer, full of ideas, confidence, and fire. He dreamed of charting the uncharted, of mapping the American West for science and glory. But dreams alone could not cross the wilderness. He needed someone who had lived it, someone who could lead men through mountains, deserts, and danger. When Frémont asked around in St. Louis, everyone gave him the same answer: find Kit Carson. So, one cold evening, Frémont met the quiet man behind the legend. Kit stood modestly, dressed in worn buckskin and carrying a weathered rifle. He wasn't tall or loud, but when he spoke, his words were calm and sure. Frémont looked into his eyes and saw a man who had faced the wild and survived it. That was all the proof he needed. Within days, the two men set off together. Frémont led his team of soldiers and scientists. Kit rode ahead as the guide, scouting the trail. Their mission was simple in words, but nearly impossible in reality: explore the Rocky Mountains, chart the path westward, and return alive. The journey began in Missouri, following the Platte River across the Great Plains. For weeks they rode through open grassland under a sky so wide it seemed endless. The men sang songs and laughed at first, but as the days passed, the land grew harsher. The heat scorched their faces by day. The cold bit their bones by night. Water grew scarce. Spirits fell, but Kit Carson never wavered. When the men lost hope, he led them forward. When food ran low, he hunted for the camp. When storms hit, he found shelter in places no one else saw. His instincts became their lifeline. Once, as the expedition crossed the foothills of the Rockies, a violent thunderstorm broke out. Lightning split the sky. Horses panicked. The river beside them began to flood. Frémont's men were terrified. But Kit's voice cut through the chaos. "Follow me!" he shouted, riding straight into the storm. The men obeyed, trusting him with their lives. Hours later, when the clouds cleared, they were safe on higher ground. Frémont watched him in awe. From that day, he called Kit Carson the best man in the West. The expedition continued for months, climbing the cold ridges of the Rocky Mountains. The higher they went, the thinner the air became. Snow blinded their eyes and froze their hands. Many thought they would die up there, but again it was Kit who kept them alive. He built fires in the wind, found paths through the snow, and guided them down to safety. When they finally reached South Pass, the gateway to the Oregon Trail, Frémont stood on a high rock and looked west. The land stretched before them like an ocean of grass and mountains. Kit Carson stood beside him, silent but proud. He wasn't thinking about maps or fame, only about the beauty of the land he loved. They made it back alive, their maps completed, their mission a success. Newspapers across America praised Frémont's courage and skill. His reports were published everywhere, calling him the Pathfinder. But inside those same pages, one name appeared again and again: the quiet man who made it all possible: Kit Carson. A year later, Frémont returned to the frontier for another expedition, and once again he chose Kit Carson as his guide. This time, they traveled even farther west, through Utah, Nevada, and California, crossing deserts where the air shimmered like fire. The men faced hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. More than once they came close to death. But wherever they turned, Kit found a way forward. He knew how to track water from dry sand, how to read animal trails, how to calm frightened men. His calmness became the heartbeat of the journey. He wasn't loud, but his silence carried strength. When they finally reached California, Kit rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon. They had crossed half a continent. What lay before them now was something even greater, a chance to bring the world's eyes to the American frontier. Frémont's reports again spread across the country, and Kit's name became legend. Children read about him in storybooks. Newspapers called him the American hunter, the frontier scout, the man without fear. Yet if you had asked Kit about it, he would have smiled shyly and said, "I just showed the way." For Kit, it was never about fame or fortune. It was about duty, adventure, and the wild itself. The mountains, rivers, and deserts had become a part of him. He guided not for glory, but because the open land called to his soul. But as history would soon show, fame has a price. The same West that gave Kit Carson his purpose would soon test him in ways no mountain or storm ever could. For now, though, he was the man who had guided America to its destiny, the quiet hero whose footprints stretched from Missouri to California. He had faced the wilderness and conquered it. But the real battles, the ones of conscience, loyalty, and heart, were still waiting beyond the next horizon. When Kit Carson returned from the great expedition with John C. Frémont, his name had already begun to echo across the nation. Newspapers wrote about the brave scout who guided explorers through deserts and mountains where no map existed. To the people in the East, Kit Carson was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, the face of courage and adventure in a land still wild and untamed. But fame was a strange thing. Kit never sought it, and he didn't quite understand it. While his name filled books and stories, he lived quietly, far from the spotlight. He preferred the smell of campfire smoke to the noise of cities. He still dressed in worn leather, still cooked over an open flame, and still rode the same horse through the same wild country. Yet wherever he went, people whispered his name with awe. In 1843, Kit married Josefa Jaramillo, a young woman from Taos, New Mexico. She was kind, gentle, and strong, everything the rough frontiersman needed to balance his restless life. With her, Kit found something he had never known before: peace. For a short while, he tried to live as a husband, a father, and a man of home instead of a man of the trail. But peace in the West was never meant to last. In 1846, war broke out between the United States and Mexico. The winds of conflict swept across the frontier, and the quiet life Kit dreamed of was over. Frémont once again called on him, this time not for exploration, but for war. Kit didn't hesitate. He knew the land, the trails, and the dangers. If America needed him, he would ride. The war in the West was brutal. There were no grand battlefields or shining armies, only small bands of soldiers fighting across deserts and mountains. Kit's knowledge of the terrain became priceless. He guided troops through enemy lines, carried messages across hundreds of miles of dangerous ground, and fought side by side with men half his age. One mission nearly cost him his life. Kit was carrying secret dispatches through enemy territory when a Mexican force surrounded his small group. The men were outnumbered and trapped. Kit volunteered to break through the lines and ride for help. Under the cover of darkness, he slipped away, racing across the desert with nothing but his horse and his courage. For days he rode, dodging patrols, surviving on almost no food or water. When he finally reached the nearest fort, his face was burned by the sun, his clothes torn, and his body weak. But the message was delivered. Reinforcements arrived, and the trapped soldiers were saved. Stories of that ride spread quickly. People called it the impossible journey. To Kit, it was just another duty done. He didn't talk about it, didn't boast. When asked how he survived, he simply said, "I kept riding." As the war continued, Kit guided American forces into California, helping to secure the territory. His reputation grew even larger. Soldiers trusted him, officers respected him. He was brave but never cruel, fierce but always fair. Many who fought beside him said he had the heart of a warrior, and the soul of a gentleman. But war leaves its mark on every man, even heroes. Kit saw suffering, not just among soldiers, but among ordinary families caught in the middle. He watched towns burn and people flee their homes. It weighed on him. The wilderness he once loved was now filled with smoke and sorrow. When the war ended in 1848, America celebrated victory. The West opened wide and settlers poured in. For most, it was a time of hope. For Kit Carson, it was a time of change. The quiet lands he once rode through were filling with wagons, towns, and strangers. The wild was slowly disappearing. Still, Kit's fame only grew. Stories about him appeared everywhere, in dime novels, newspapers, and songs. Writers turned his life into legend. They made him larger than life, a fearless gunslinger, a perfect hero who never missed a shot and never knew fear. Kit didn't recognize the man they described. He once said softly, "They make me 10 feet tall and bulletproof, but I'm just a man who's seen a lot of miles." In truth, Kit was a man of contradictions, brave yet humble, fierce yet kind. He could track a man through mountains, but he would also stop to feed a hungry stranger. He was respected by many native tribes because he treated them with fairness and spoke their languages. But the growing wave of settlers brought tension, and Kit found himself caught in the middle, between the old world and the new. After the war, he was appointed as an Indian agent for the Ute and Jicarilla Apache tribes. It was a job that required patience, honesty, and courage, qualities he had in abundance. He tried to protect the tribes from greedy settlers and dishonest officials. Many native leaders trusted him more than they trusted the government itself. Kit believed that peace could exist if people simply kept their word. But the world around him was changing too fast. Promises were broken, treaties ignored, and trust began to die. He could feel the pressure of history pressing against him. The young boy who once ran away from home to find adventure was now a man standing between two nations, two worlds, the old and the new America. He didn't yet know it, but the hardest chapter of his life was still to come. For now, though, Kit Carson was a hero of the West, a man celebrated by presidents, generals, and settlers alike. But deep inside, he remained the same quiet soul who preferred the sound of the wind through the trees to the cheers of a crowd. As he rode home to Taos, the stars above seemed endless. Maybe he thought of Josefa waiting by the fire. Maybe he thought of the mountains where he once hunted and trapped. Or maybe, just maybe, he thought about how even heroes grow tired, and how peace, though brief, was worth fighting for. But history wasn't done with Kit Carson yet. His next battles wouldn't be against armies or outlaws. They would be against guilt, duty, and the weight of his own legend. By the early 1860s, the name Kit Carson had become legendary across America. He was known as the fearless scout, the loyal soldier, and the man who helped open the West. But behind that fame was a tired man, one who had seen too many miles, too many graves, and too much change. He wanted peace. But the world around him was moving toward war again. The American Civil War had begun, and even in the far West, its shadow reached across the land. Confederate forces moved into New Mexico territory, and the Union needed men who knew the desert trails, the rivers, and the mountains. Once again, they called for Kit Carson. He was no longer a young man. His hair had turned gray, his body worn from years of hardship, but his spirit was still unbroken. He joined the Union Army as a colonel of volunteers, leading men through a landscape more deadly than any battlefield. At first, his duty was simple: defend New Mexico from Confederate invasion. Carson and his troops fought bravely in the Battle of Val Verde in 1862, holding their ground against trained soldiers with far better weapons. They were outnumbered, but Kit's calm leadership and knowledge of the land kept them alive. His courage turned defeat into survival. But the Civil War was not the only battle raging in the West. Across the frontier, tensions between settlers and native tribes were growing worse each year. Broken promises, stolen land, and hunger had turned peace into hatred. Raids and attacks spread across New Mexico, and the U.S. Army decided that the only way to end the conflict was to force the tribes onto reservations. And once again, they turned to Kit Carson, the man who had lived among native people, who spoke their languages and respected their ways, was now ordered to lead a campaign against them. It was a cruel twist of fate and the darkest test of his life. In 1863, Carson was given command of an operation against the Navajo Nation, The plan came from General James Carleton, who believed that if the Navajo were driven from their homes and their food destroyed, they would surrender. Carson didn't agree with the plan. He knew what it meant. But he was a soldier now, sworn to obey. The campaign began with fire. Carson's men burned Navajo fields, cut down peach orchards, and destroyed sheep herds. Villages were reduced to ashes. The goal was not battle. It was starvation. Kit followed orders, his heart heavy with guilt. He once said quietly to a friend, "I hate this work, but it is my duty." Winter came hard that year. The Navajo people fled into the mountains, hiding in canyons and caves. Carson's troops hunted them relentlessly. It was said that even the soldiers wept at the sight of the suffering they caused. Finally, starving and broken, thousands of Navajo surrendered. Then came the order that would forever mark history. They were to be marched hundreds of miles east to a reservation at Bosque Redondo. That march became known as the Long Walk. More than 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forced to leave their homeland. They walked through freezing winters, across rivers and deserts, with little food or water. Many died along the way, from hunger, exhaustion, or disease. Mothers carried their children's bodies because they couldn't bear to leave them behind. Carson didn't lead the march himself, but the campaign bore his name. To the soldiers, he was still a hero. To the Navajo, he became a symbol of loss and sorrow. It was a stain that no amount of bravery could wash away. At Bosque Redondo, life was miserable. The land was dry and barren. Crops failed. Disease spread. Even Carson, visiting the camp later, admitted that the place was unfit for human life. He urged the government to help, but his voice was small compared to the machinery of power that had already decided the fate of thousands. For the first time, Kit Carson's heart began to break under the weight of his own legend. He had spent a lifetime taming the frontier, guiding men to new lands, building a nation. But now he saw the cost, not in maps or glory, but in people. He tried to make peace wherever he could. In later years, he negotiated with tribes, seeking fair treatment and safety for those who remained. He used his position to protect rather than destroy, but the damage had been done, and he knew it. In quiet moments, he sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Friends said he spoke less and less. His eyes carried a sadness that words could not describe. He had lived long enough to see himself turned into both hero and villain, worshipped by one world, hated by another, yet even in sorrow, there was still goodness in him. He cared deeply for his family, especially his wife Josefa and the children who brought him laughter in dark times. He built a small home in Taos, where he hoped to spend his final years in peace. But the frontier had marked him forever. He would always be the man between two worlds, the bridge and the wound, the explorer and the soldier, the dreamer and the destroyer. The name Kit Carson would live on in songs, stories, and towns across America. But for the man himself, the glory had faded. What remained was a quiet wish for forgiveness, not from history, but from the land itself. He once told a friend, "I've done what I thought was right. I've done what I was told. But sometimes, I wonder if I did too much." And as he looked across the desert he once called home, he must have known that the land would never forget his footsteps, or the tears that followed them. The war was over. But the peace that followed brought little comfort to Kit Carson. He had survived the battles, the long rides, and the endless dangers of the frontier. Yet something inside him was different now, quieter, heavier. The wilderness that once filled him with wonder now whispered of regret. He returned home to Taos, New Mexico, to his wife Josefa and their growing family. Their adobe home stood near the mountains, simple but warm, filled with the laughter of children. For the first time in many years, Kit tried to live not as a soldier or a scout, but as a husband and a father. The people of Taos respected him deeply. They saw him as a man of honor, a protector. When he walked through town, men tipped their hats and women greeted him kindly. But when he sat alone on his porch at night, staring at the horizon, his thoughts wandered far from peace. He had built a reputation that stretched across the country. Newspapers still called him a hero, an American legend, the man who tamed the wild. But Kit knew the truth. He knew what the stories left out, the faces of those who suffered, the cries of the Navajo on the Long Walk, the endless wars that never truly ended. Still, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He didn't argue with history. He simply lived each day trying to do what was right. As the years passed, the old life began to fade. The fur trappers were gone. The endless plains he once rode across were filling with farms and fences. Railroads now carved through lands that had once belonged to buffalo and tribes. Kit had spent his life exploring an untamed America. Now, he watched it disappear before his eyes. In those days, he worked as an Indian agent, helping native tribes adjust to a world that no longer had space for them. He fought for their food supplies, defended them from dishonest traders, and spoke to government officials on their behalf. Many of the native people trusted him. Some even called him a friend. He often rode long distances to deliver aid or negotiate peace. His body was older now, his strength fading, but his sense of duty remained as sharp as ever. He never turned away from a task, no matter how small. That was who he was, a man who kept his word, even when the world forgot its promises. Josefa stood by his side through it all. She was his comfort, his anchor. She cared for their children while he rode the lonely trails. When he returned, she met him with warmth and patience, softening the rough edges of a man who had lived too long among violence and dust. Together they created the kind of peace he had always searched for in the wilderness. Friends who visited their home said that Kit was happiest when surrounded by his children. He would sit quietly as they played, smiling, sometimes telling stories of his younger days, tales of snow-covered mountains and wild rivers. But he never glorified war. He told his sons and daughters that courage wasn't about killing or fighting. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. But life, even for heroes, doesn't stand still. The years of hardship had taken their toll. Kit began to suffer from chest pain and shortness of breath. Doctors said his lungs were weak, too many winters, too much smoke and cold air. He tried to ignore it, to keep working, but his body was failing him. Then tragedy struck. In April 1868, Josefa gave birth to their 8th child. The delivery was difficult and her health quickly worsened. Kit sat by her side, holding her hand, helpless as she struggled for breath. Within days, she was gone. The woman who had given him peace, who had waded through every journey and war, was lost to him forever. Friends said that something inside Kit broke that day. The fire that had carried him through every danger finally dimmed. He wandered the house in silence, holding his newborn child, his eyes empty but gentle. To those who knew him, it was clear. The great scout, the fearless soldier, was now just a grieving husband and father. Only a few weeks later, his own health collapsed. He was taken to Fort Lyon, Colorado Territory, where doctors tried to help him. He was weak but calm. He knew his time was near. One by one, his friends came to visit. They sat by his bed, listening to his soft voice, still kind, still humble. He spoke of his family, his adventures, and the changing West. He said he hoped his children would live in a world with fewer battles and more peace. There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet acceptance. On the morning of May 23, 1868, Kit Carson took a deep breath and whispered his final words. Adios, compadres. Goodbye, my friends. He was 58 years old, the man who had ridden across mountains, crossed deserts, faced war and death, and guided America's path to the Pacific, was finally at rest. His body was returned to Taos and buried beside his beloved Josefa. The people of New Mexico mourned him deeply. Even those who once hated his name came to pay their respects. To some, he was still a hero, to others a reminder of pain. But to all, he was part of the story of the West, the light and the shadow, the dream and the cost. As the years passed, statues were built, towns and mountains were named after him. His legend grew larger than the man himself. But those who knew him remembered something different, not the hero in books, but the quiet, weary man who always tried to do right, even when the world was wrong. And maybe that's the real truth of Kit Carson. Not that he was perfect, but that he was human. A man who lived, loved, fought, and searched for peace in a land that gave none easily. When Kit Carson died in 1868, the West fell silent for a moment. The people who had known him, soldiers, scouts, settlers, and native families, all felt the weight of his passing. He had been a man of the land, a man of action, and now he was gone. But death did not end his story. It only began another one. the story of how a man became a myth. In the years that followed, America began to change faster than anyone could imagine. The railroads spread across the plains, linking the east to the west. Towns rose where once there had been wilderness. The frontier, the world that had shaped Kit Carson, was disappearing. And as the wild faded, people began to miss it. They missed the danger, the freedom, the endless sky. They missed the spirit of the frontier, and so they looked for heroes to remind them of it. Kit Carson became one of those heroes. Writers and storytellers in the East filled newspapers and books with tales of his adventures. They called him the Prince of the Prairies, the Fearless Scout, and the Man Who Never Knew Fear. In their stories, Carson was larger than life, fighting bandits, taming wild animals, rescuing settlers, and bringing justice to the lawless West. But these stories were not always true. The real Kit Carson had been a quiet man, humble and thoughtful. He didn't brag, he didn't chase fame, and he didn't see himself as perfect. Yet the world turned him into a legend so grand that even he wouldn't have recognized the man in the stories. Some writers said he single-handedly conquered the West. Others claimed he fought hundreds of battles. There were even stories of him shooting 20 men in a single day, all fantasy created to sell books. The truth was simpler and far more human. Kit Carson was not a perfect hero. He was brave, yes. Loyal, yes. But he also made mistakes. He followed orders that brought suffering to innocent people. He fought wars that broke hearts as well as borders. As the years passed, the myth grew stronger, and the man faded into legend. Children learned his name in schools. Towns, counties, and mountains were named after him. Carson City in Nevada, Carson County in Texas, Kit Carson Peak in Colorado, and many more. His name became part of America's map, written into the very land he once crossed on horseback. But not everyone saw him as a hero. Among the Navajo, his name became a symbol of pain. They remembered the burned villages, the lost orchards, the endless march of the Long Walk. To them, Kit Carson was not the brave frontiersman of legend. He was the man who brought sorrow to their people. As historians looked deeper into his life, the story of Kit Carson grew complicated. Some saw him as a man of his time, a soldier following orders, doing his duty in an age of conquest. Others saw him as a man who should have known better, a man who helped destroy the very world he loved. And perhaps both were true. Kit Carson's life sits in that narrow space between right and wrong, between heroism and tragedy. He was a bridge between two worlds, the old America of the frontier and the new America of cities and progress. He walked that bridge as best he could, sometimes with honor, sometimes with doubt. For all his flaws, Kit Carson left behind something no one could deny, a story that shaped the imagination of a nation. The idea that courage, loyalty, and determination could carve a path through any wilderness. The idea that one man, no matter how humble, could change the course of history. Even today, his story is told in movies, books, and museums. Some tell it with pride, others with pain. But every version reminds us that the frontier was not a place of easy choices. It was a place where good and bad lived side by side, just like the people who built it. When you look at a map and see the name Carson, you are not just looking at a word. You are looking at a memory of the boy who ran away from a saddle shop, of the scout who crossed deserts, of the soldier who followed orders, and of the man who carried the burden of his own legend. He was not a saint. He was not a monster. He was something far more real, human, and maybe that's why his story still matters. Because in Kit Carson, we see the story of America itself. Brave, flawed, hopeful, and haunted. A land always reaching for greatness, even when it forgets the cost. In the end, history remembers him in two voices, one of glory, one of grief. The truth lies somewhere between them, carried by the wind that still blows across the plains he once rode. For some, he will always be the hero who opened the West. For others, he will forever be the man who closed a chapter of innocence and freedom for those who lived there first. But either way, the story of Kit Carson endures, not because he was perfect, but because he was real, a man made of dust, dreams, and contradictions, a man who helped build a nation, even as he struggled to understand it. And though time has blurred his name into legend, if you stand beneath the wide sky of the West at night, you might still feel what he once felt. The call of the open land, the whisper of the wind, and the quiet heartbeat of a life lived on the edge of history. After Kit Carson's death, the world did not forget him. In fact, his name began to shine brighter than ever, not as a man, but as a myth. The America he had helped explore was now being transformed. Railroads cut across the open plains. Telegraph wires hummed where buffalo once roamed. The Wild West, once a dangerous living frontier, was slowly fading into memory. But people still hungered for its stories. They wanted heroes. They wanted legends. And so they turned the life of Kit Carson into something larger than truth. It began with the dime novels, small, cheap paperbacks sold for a few cents at train stations and markets. The writers who created them had never met Kit Carson, and most had never seen the West. But that didn't stop them. They filled pages with adventure, bravery, and gunfights that never happened. In their stories, Kit Carson was not a quiet, humble man. He was a fearless warrior, a gunfighter who rode into danger without blinking. He fought bandits, rescued maidens, outsmarted villains, and defeated entire tribes single-handedly. Each story was wilder than the last, and readers couldn't get enough. These tales spread across the country like wildfire. Boys in cities dreamed of riding horses across open plains. Men in factories read about the freedom of the frontier. Kit Carson became the symbol of a world they could only imagine. A world of courage, honor, and adventure. The truth of the man disappeared beneath the legend. In the East, where people had never seen a desert or a mountain range, Kit Carson's name was almost sacred. He was spoken of alongside Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, the great pioneers who had tamed the wilderness. His image was printed on posters, calendars, and even tobacco tins. And yet back in the West, in New Mexico, Colorado, and among the native people, his name carried a very different meaning. To some, he was a hero. To others, a reminder of pain. But the world preferred the easier story, the one that made them proud of their nation's expansion. By the late 1800s, Buffalo Bill Cody brought the myth of the West to the stage with his Wild West show, a traveling performance that mixed history with theater, turning frontier life into spectacle. Cowboys performed mock battles, sharpshooters hit impossible targets, and Native Americans played their part in carefully scripted scenes. Kit Carson himself was gone, but his name lived on in those performances, actors dressed as him reenacting his supposed adventures for cheering crowds. He became a character, a symbol of courage and destiny. Each show, each act, added another layer to the legend. In those days, America wanted heroes who looked invincible. They wanted to believe that courage alone could shape a nation. Kit Carson became the perfect symbol for that dream. The man who conquered mountains, who faced danger with honor, who represented the unstoppable march of progress. But as the 20th century began, a new invention carried his story even farther: the motion picture. Silent films of the early 1900s brought the Wild West to the silver screen, and Kit Carson's name appeared again and again. In one of the earliest westerns, simply titled Kit Carson, 1903, actors portrayed him as the noble frontiersman, standing tall against villains, defending settlers, and bringing justice to the wild. Audiences loved it. They didn't care about the real man behind the name. They wanted the hero. Soon, more films followed. Kit Carson became one of the most filmed characters of the early Western era. By the 1940s, Hollywood had turned his legend into a polished story, full of action, romance, and patriotism. But with fame came questions. As historians began digging into the real records, they found that the truth was not so simple. They discovered his role in the Navajo campaign, the destruction of villages, the suffering of innocent people. Slowly, a new conversation began, one that asked not just what Kit Carson did, but why. Was he a hero? Or was he part of something darker, a man shaped by his time, doing what his world demanded no matter the cost? The legend didn't die, but it began to change. In books and films, he started to appear more human, brave but flawed, strong but conflicted. Artists and writers began to show the two sides of his story, the explorer and the soldier, the protector and the destroyer, and maybe that's what keeps his story alive, because Kit Carson's life was never just about adventure. It was about what happens when a man stands at the crossroads of history. A man trying to do good in a world where good and evil were often the same color of dust. Today, his name can be found everywhere, in cities, counties, schools, mountains, and parks. Monuments tell of his bravery, Museums tell of his complexity. To some, he remains a hero of discovery. To others, a symbol of the cost of conquest. But no matter how you see him, one truth remains. Kit Carson's story is the story of America itself, bold, restless, and torn between pride and regret. More than 150 years have passed since his death, but his legend still rides through the American imagination, sometimes as a hero on a white horse, sometimes as a shadow crossing the desert. And if you listen to the wind across the plains he once rode, it still whispers his name, part truth, part myth. Forever remembered, Kit Carson, the man who could not be forgotten. More than a century had passed since Kit Carson's death, yet his name still echoed across America. In old towns and new cities, people still saw his name on street signs, schools, and mountain peaks. His face appeared in museums, his stories in books, his legend in film. For generations, he was the model of the brave frontiersman, the man who carved the American West from wilderness. But as the years went on, America began to look at its past with new eyes. Historians started asking difficult questions. The same stories that once filled hearts with pride now stirred unease. The frontier, once seen as a triumph, was now also seen as a tragedy for the people who had lived there long before the settlers came. And at the center of that conversation stood one man, Kit Carson. In classrooms, scholars began to look beyond the myths and dime novels. They turned to letters, diaries, and military records. They discovered the details of his campaigns, the destruction of Navajo villages, the burning of crops, the long walk to Bosque Redondo. The man who had once been called a hero was now seen by many as a symbol of conquest and suffering. The image of Kit Carson began to split in two. For some, he remained the courageous scout, a man who risked his life to explore the unknown, who guided pioneers across impossible landscapes and who stood loyal to his duty. To them, Carson was a man of his time, shaped by the harsh realities of a world that demanded survival and obedience. For others, he became a symbol of the darker side of America's expansion, the cost of manifest destiny, the violence against native tribes, the broken promises that scarred generations. They saw him not as a villain, but as a warning of what happens when progress ignores compassion. Across the West, debates began to grow louder. Some towns removed his statues, others defended them, saying that erasing history meant forgetting it. Streets and schools that carried his name became battlegrounds of memory. Was Kit Carson to be celebrated or condemned, honored or questioned? The truth, as always, lived somewhere in between. Kit Carson was not the pure hero of the dime novels, nor was he the cold villain some made him out to be. He was both a product and a prisoner of his time, a man trying to do right in a world built on the edge of chaos. He lived by the code of the frontier, loyalty, duty, courage. But he also lived under orders that clashed with his heart. He tried to protect the tribes he once fought. He tried to make peace in a world that did not yet understand what peace meant. Modern historians now see him as something rare, a man who stood in the center of America's transformation, caught between the old world and the new. He was a bridge between wilderness and civilization, between freedom and authority, between kindness and cruelty. His story forces people to face a truth about history itself. Heroes are never perfect, and villains are never simple. The past is not a single story, it's a collection of voices, each telling a different truth. In recent years, museums and authors have begun to tell Kit Carson's story with honesty. They show his bravery, his endurance through storms, his skill as a scout, his loyalty to friends. But they also tell of the suffering caused by his campaigns, the pain that still echoes in the hearts of the Navajo people. At the Bosque Redondo Memorial in New Mexico, visitors walk among exhibits that tell both sides of his legacy, the hero and the human. Some leave with pride, others with sorrow, but all with understanding. Because Kit Carson's life, more than anything, teaches that history is not about perfection. It's about learning from the past, so we do not repeat it. His story still inspires artists, filmmakers, and writers. Some see him as a symbol of courage in the face of the unknown. Others use his story to remind us that even the bravest hearts can make mistakes when blinded by duty. In classrooms, teachers now ask students to think deeply, what makes a hero? Is it the man who follows orders, or the man who questions them? Can someone do great things and still carry great guilt? For Kit Carson, those answers may never be simple. But that is what keeps his story alive. He is a mirror, reflecting both the best and the worst of what America has been. His life holds lessons of strength, endurance, and courage, but also of humility, empathy, and accountability. Today, when you stand beneath the vast western sky, the same one he once rode beneath, you can still feel his presence. Not as the untouchable hero of books or films, but as a man who lived through the greatest changes of his time. A man who loved, fought, regretted, and kept going. That is why Kit Carson's story endures. Because it is not just about the past. It is about who we are now, how we remember, how we forgive, and how we face the truth of the people who built our world. He was not made of legend. He was made of flesh and bone, triumph and failure, light and shadow, just like every person who ever tried to make sense of a changing world. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years after his death, we still speak his name, not as praise or blame, but as a reminder that even those who walk the hardest roads can teach us something about what it means to be human. More than 150 years have passed since Kit Carson took his final breath. Yet his shadow still stretches across the land he once rode. His story, born in the dust of the frontier, still rides with the wind, sometimes as a whisper of pride, sometimes as a cry of pain. Time has changed the world that Kit once knew. The great open plains he crossed are now highways. The rivers he followed have bridges and dams. The wilderness he called home has become towns and cities filled with people who may never have heard the wind the way he did. But his name remains. It lives in maps, in monuments, in memory. Across America, people still argue about what that name means. To some, Kit Carson is a symbol of bravery, the man who faced the unknown and helped build a nation. To others, he is a symbol of sorrow, the man whose actions, however loyal, brought pain to those who called the land home long before him. Both stories are true. The truth of Kit Carson's life cannot be captured in one word or one image. It lives in the spaces between courage and cruelty, between honor and obedience, between discovery and destruction. He was not just a man of his time. He was a man caught inside time, shaped by it, bound by it, and in many ways broken by it. Yet even with his flaws, his story endures because it mirrors something deep in the American spirit, the endless struggle between dreams and consequences. The West that Kit Carson helped explore became a symbol of possibility. It stood for freedom, adventure, and the human need to see what lies beyond the next horizon. But that same journey came with a cost, the cost of lives, lands, and cultures lost in the pursuit of expansion. Kit Carson's life sits at that crossroads. He was both the dream and the price. In the quiet hills of Taos, New Mexico, where he is buried beside his wife Josefa, the air is still. Visitors stand by his grave, reading the simple stone that bears his name. Some leave flowers, some stand in silence, some whisper prayers for understanding. They come not to worship a hero, but to remember a man who left home at 16 with nothing but courage in his heart. A man who crossed deserts, climbed mountains, and faced death more times than he could count. A man who tried to serve his country, protect his family, and do his duty, even when duty demanded too much. In the end, Kit Carson's life reminds us that history is never clean. It is not made of perfect heroes or pure villains. It is made of people, flawed, brave, frightened, and hopeful. People who, like Kit, did the best they could with the world they were given. Today, historians tell his story differently. They speak of his compassion as well as his cruelty, his strength as well as his doubt. They tell of his efforts to bring peace between tribes and settlers, his heartbreak over what he could not change, and his quiet wish for forgiveness. Through these stories, a more complete picture emerges, not of a legend, but of a man. And maybe that is the greatest legacy of all. Because when we see Kit Carson as a man, not a myth, we see ourselves more clearly. We see how easy it is to lose sight of what's right when following orders, how quickly good intentions can lead to harm, and how history often asks impossible things of ordinary people. For the Navajo, his name still carries pain. For the descendants of pioneers, it carries pride. For historians, it carries questions that may never be fully answered. And for the land itself, the mountains, the plains, the desert winds, it carries memory. In those memories, Kit Carson is not just the scout or the soldier or the symbol. He is the heartbeat of a nation growing up, strong, flawed, and searching for balance. He once stood at the edge of a map and saw only mystery ahead. Today we stand at the edge of his story and see something just as mysterious, the truth of human nature. It is said that legends never die. But in the end, Kit Carson's greatest gift is not his legend, it's his lesson. A reminder that greatness is not about power or fame, but about the courage to face who you are, even when the truth is hard to bear. So when you think of Kit Carson, do not see him only as the hero or the villain. See him as both, because that is where his humanity lives. His story, like the West itself, is made of contradictions, light and shadow, victory and loss, hope and regret. And yet through it all, there remains one constant, the will to keep moving forward. That was the spirit of Kit Carson. That is the spirit of America. As the sun sets over the western horizon and the wind whispers through the sage, you can almost hear his voice, faint, tired, but proud. Adios, compadres. A final goodbye from a man who spent his life chasing the horizon and became part of it forever.